Muy buenos días, presidenta del Parlamento de Canarias, presidenta y vicepresidenta de la Zona Especial Canaria, director de Relaciones Económicas con África, delegado de la Zona Franca, directora general de la Cámara de Comercio, cónsul de Colombia, autoridades civiles y militares, secretaria general de la Casa. A todos ustedes, muchísimas gracias por asistir hoy a la presentación del informe sobre perspectivas económicas en África que elabora la OCDE y que este año versa sobre las ciudades sostenibles y la transformación estructural de las ciudades. Agradecer inicialmente a la OCDE y en concreto a su Centro de Desarrollo por colaborar un año más con Casa África en la presentación de este informe tan importante para las empresas canarias que hoy celebramos aquí, y mañana se presentará este mismo informe en la sede de la COE en Madrid, tanto, como digo, para las empresas como para las instituciones aquí representadas. También agradecer muy especialmente la presencia del consejero de Economía, Industria, Comercio y Conocimiento del Gobierno de Canarias, que hablará a mi continuación, pero les digo que me ha pedido que les disculpe porque se tiene que ir a otra reunión rápidamente. Y también agradecer a lo que es ISEX, Proesca, la Cámara de Comercio y ASINCA por la difusión de esta jornada. Y es un placer presentarles hoy aquí a una persona de la trayectoria de Federico Bonaglia. Es el asesor principal del director del Centro de Desarrollo. Federico atesora una amplísima experiencia en el desarrollo de las economías en desarrollo y principalmente experto en lo que serían las economías africanas. Casa África, como ustedes saben, nosotros presentamos cada año 4 grandes informes económicos de África con el fin de que cada vez los temas africanos sean más conocidos por las empresas y por las instituciones españolas y, por supuesto, las Canarias. Siempre presentamos el Doing Business África, lo hacemos de la mano del Banco Mundial. Presentamos el Invest in Africa, esto lo hacemos de la mano del grupo de estudios del Financial Times, del periódico británico, que lo hacemos principalmente en Madrid. Y con la Organización Mundial del Turismo también presentamos el informe sobre el turismo en el continente africano. Hacemos el African Tourist Report, tanto la Organización Mundial del Turismo como nosotros, sobre cada año sobre las tendencias y evolución del turismo en el continente africano. Y este año vamos a presentar también un informe, lo haremos en Santa Cruz de Tenerife, con la autoridad portuaria de allí, sobre el Review Maritime Transport. Naciones Unidas elabora cada año un informe sobre el transporte marítimo mundial, y este año le hemos pedido que en Tenerife el mes que viene nos presente cuál es el sector del transporte marítimo en el continente africano. Este informe, que se llama en inglés el African Economic Outlook, en España Perspectivas Económicas de África, es una publicación que hace conjunta la OCDE, hoy tenemos aquí a uno de sus máximos ejecutivos, el Banco Africano de Desarrollo y el Programa de las Naciones Unidas para el Desarrollo, y que se ha convertido en una referencia mundial a la hora de tomarle el pulso a la economía africana. Como ustedes saben, el rendimiento de África se ha mantenido firme en el año 2015, el año pasado, a pesar de estar en medio de unos enfrentamientos globales que han tenido en el mundo, inclusive unos shocks regionales que también ha habido en el continente africano. Pero sigue siendo la segunda región del mundo que más crece, después de Asia. África ha conseguido una mejora significativa de la vida de más de 100 millones de africanos, un continente que tiene 1.100 millones. En el último año, los últimos años, más de 100 millones de africanos han podido salir de la pobreza y ya está en esa clase media baja, que está significando la demografía africana. Pero todavía queda mucho por hacer, porque más del 60% de la población de África urbana vive todavía en unas condiciones en barrios que no tienen ningún tipo de servicio básico, ni infraestructura, ni seguridad. Ya en África, que antes era un mercado que era muy conocido porque tener muy desperdigada su población, ya hay 60 ciudades en África de más de 1 millón de habitantes. No la hay en Europa, no la hay en Estados Unidos, y ya sí la hay en África, como digo, 60 ciudades con más de 1 millón de habitantes. Y desde el punto de vista económico, ayer salió un informe, el McKinsey Global Institute nos dice que ya hay 400 empresas africanas que facturan más de 1.000 millones de dólares. y 700 que facturan más de 500 millones de dólares. Es decir, que ya la empresa africana está cada vez más presente en la feria internacional y, lógicamente, para la empresa española hay que tenerla muy en cuenta, ¿no? De España, nuestro país, tiene en África presentes 1.500 empresas. El 40% de ellas están instaladas en el Reino de Marruecos, el resto en el África subsahariana. Y los datos referidos a la comunidad, a la relación de la comunidad canaria con África, lógicamente los comentará ahora el consejero. Pero sí le quería dar unos apuntes importantes sobre el continente, ¿no? Y 3 maneras donde llegan ingresos al continente africano. A África le llegan unos flujos financieros de más de 200 billones con B de dólares anualmente. El año pasado bajaron un 2% con respecto al 2014. En cambio, la ayuda oficial sí creció un 4% y se cifra la ayuda oficial a África en 56 billones de dólares en el año pasado, en el 2015. Y las remesas que mandan los inmigrantes, las personas que están fuera, que envían dinero a su país, que es la fuente individual más estable e importante de financiación externa, ascendió a 64 billones de dólares. Y es la parte más importante que recibe África, son las remesas de los propios africanos. Y desde el punto de vista de nuestras empresas, pues me habrán oído los que ya vienen a estas conferencias que, así como dije que el año pasado, el anterior, España había sido el primer país que más concursos y licitación ganó en el Banco Africano. En el último ranking estamos los terceros, detrás de Francia y de Italia. Somos el tercer país europeo que más concursos y licitaciones ha ganado. Lo del año anterior fue un tema excepcional por una inversión en energías renovables que nos colocó en el ranking en el número 1, pero que era un ranking un poco ficticio, porque efectivamente tanto Francia como Italia nos están superando en lo que es la inversión de concursos y licitaciones que ofrece el Banco Africano. Pero no está mal ser, como digo, el tercer país presente, ¿no? Por encima de Alemania, Reino Unido, Estados Unidos, por ejemplo, ¿no? Y la semana pasada vimos en los medios de comunicación que ya el presidente Juncker de la Comisión Europea comunicó que se van a destinar 44.000 nuevos millones de dólares, de euros, a intentar reflotar la economía africana y que espera que se duplique con la aportación de los países miembros. En definitiva, son fuertes inversiones que tienen que llegar a ese continente tan necesitado y que espero que cristalicen en muy poco tiempo, ¿no? Y ahora, a través de la conferencia de Federico Bonaglia, pues vamos a conocer de primera mano qué diagnóstico hace de África la OCDE, una de las instituciones más prestigiosas en las elaboraciones de estos informes, ¿no? Cuáles son las fórmulas que recomienda para que el continente africano realmente tenga un crecimiento inclusivo con el que se genere igualdad de oportunidades para todos los africanos. Pero antes de eso, sí me gustaría darle la palabra al consejero de Economía para que también nos dé su visión sobre la relación y la importancia estratégica que tiene este continente para el Gobierno de Canarias. Y a todos, muchas gracias por asistir hoy a esta conferencia.
Señor Director General de Casa de África, señor representante del Centro de Desarrollo de la OCDE, Presidenta del Parlamento de Canarias, Director General de Asuntos con África, Presidente y Vicepresidenta de la SEC, diputada, Director de la Zona Franca, Directora de la Cámara de Gran Canaria, cónsules, autoridad militar, pues buenos días a todos. Antes de comenzar, quiero agradecer a Casa de África su invitación a participar en la presentación del informe sobre perspectivas económicas africanas 2016. Asimismo, también quiero destacar la labor continua que desarrolla Casa de África para dar a conocer la realidad cambiante de un continente que está tan próximo, pero a la vez tan diferente como es África, y cuyo futuro está directamente ligado con el de España y más concretamente con el de Canarias. El informe sobre perspectivas económicas de África para el 2016, que hoy se presenta, corrobora el buen ritmo de crecimiento económico que en los últimos años ya viene dándose en este continente, y con una previsión de crecimiento para el 2017 de un 4,17%. 4,5, perdón. Es un dato que sin duda es muy positivo y que indica que a pesar de la caída de los precios internacionales de las materias primas, que son una de sus principales fuentes de ingresos, África seguirá experimentando un crecimiento muy importante. Un dato que además resulta especialmente relevante en una situación económica mundial como la que vivimos y que implica grandes oportunidades para Canarias. Al mismo tiempo, el estudio ofrece algunas claves sobre las consecuencias que este crecimiento está teniendo en el desarrollo socioeconómico de África, así como sería la rápida urbanización o el boom demográfico que están viviendo las grandes ciudades. Claves que pueden ayudar a Canarias a definir nuevas estrategias de cooperación y de acercamiento a este continente con el fin de ser partícipe y de contribuir en la medida de nuestras posibilidades a su crecimiento. Si realmente queremos convertir en una realidad la oportunidad que representa para Canarias el vivir a 200 millas de la costa africana, debemos conocer bien en qué podemos colaborar para garantizar el desarrollo africano. Tenemos que saber coordinar nuestro interés por abrirnos a internacionalizar la economía del archipiélago a las necesidades de desarrollo que tiene África. En Canarias llevamos varias décadas trabajando para consolidar unos lazos económicos, empresariales, sociales y culturales con nuestros países vecinos del continente africano. Y fruto de este trabajo y de nuestra condición de región fronteriza de la Unión Europea, durante los años 2007 a 2013 hemos desarrollado más de 100 proyectos de cooperación cofinanciados con los fondos europeos, como son los programas MAC y los programas POCTEFEX, junto a varios países africanos, que en concreto serían Cabo Verde, Marruecos, Senegal y Mauritania. Se trata de proyectos en los que Canarias ha trasladado su conocimiento y buen hacer en áreas que resultan fundamentales para el crecimiento de África, como es el caso de la planificación territorial y el desarrollo urbano-rural sostenible, dos aspectos que están destacados en el informe que hoy se van a presentar. Además, a partir del 2017, esperamos emprender nuevos proyectos dentro de la convocatoria del Programa de Cooperación Territorial Canarias, Azores, Madeira, Canarias, 2014-2020, en el que por primera vez Senegal, Cabo Verde y Mauritania entran a formar parte como socios de pleno derecho. A esta primera convocatoria, con 52 millones de dotación, que fue lanzada en febrero de este año, se han presentado un total de 215 proyectos, en los que participan más de 300 entidades de países africanos, lo que demuestra el interés mutuo que existe por este tipo de colaboración. El hecho de que Europa haya decidido duplicar el presupuesto del programa MAC, pasando de los 65 millones del programa anterior a los 130 millones de esta nueva etapa, es también una prueba evidente de la confianza que tiene Europa en el Gobierno de Canarias y este tipo de cooperación como un buen motor de desarrollo. De manera paralela, también se está impulsando la internacionalización de las empresas canarias. Hoy en día son 174 las empresas canarias las que operan con África, aunque esperamos que este número pueda aumentar de manera progresiva en los próximos años. Precisamente esta misma semana hemos presentado la base de la Estrategia Operativa de la Internacionalización de la Economía Canaria 2016-2020, un instrumento en el que se van a integrar todas las políticas y estrategias relacionadas con la internacionalización de las empresas y de la economía canaria, y en el que África será uno de los destinos prioritarios a los que encauzar nuestros esfuerzos y que sin duda alguna se utilizarán los datos que hoy nos aporte el representante de la OCDE para poderlos utilizar en el buen resultado, los buenos objetivos de esa estrategia. Muchas gracias.
Nos acompaña en la mesa don Pablo Martín Carvajal, director de Relaciones Económicas con África y consejero delegado de Proesca. Bueno, y ahora le doy la palabra a don Federico Bonaglia. Él habla español perfectamente, pero no se atreve a hablar en español y ha preferido, se encuentra más cómodo hacerlo en inglés, por lo que los que lo precisen tienen los auriculares a su disposición. Federico.
Gracias, Luis. Buenos días, todo el mundo, señoras y señores. Es un placer estar aquí. Mi español no es muy fluido y no quiero ofender la lengua de Cervantes, donde puedo hablar en inglés. Si necesita ponerme preguntas en español, pero después interagir en español también. Creo que tenemos una PowerPoint.
¿Tienes aquí el mando?
Gracias. Muchas gracias. Let me start by saying thank you. Thank you for the invitation. It is a great pleasure to be here again for the Development Center. This is an annual event that we keep very close to our heart. It's also a pleasure to be in Casa Africa, here in Canary Islands, and also having our annual presentation in Madrid that we will have tomorrow. And I would like to thank Luis for the very kind invitation, the spotless organization. I understand that I have about 25 minutes to present you the African Economic Outlook. Let me take 30 seconds before starting to give you a very brief introduction to the institution I represent and to the report that I'm going to present. I come from the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and within the OECD, I'm currently acting as Deputy Director of the Development Center, which is a very special institution within the OECD, because it was created 1 year after the OECD in 1962. The OECD was created in 1961, and it was created upon the wish of John Fitzgerald Kennedy, at the time President of the United States, because at the time there was a need that was felt to promote a dialogue between what we call at the time the first world and the third world, or developed countries and developing countries. And so the Development Center was created with a view to promote a dialogue between advanced economies and developing economies. And we do this by doing a lot of analysis on developing countries, including in Africa, but we also do it by having as fully fledged members of the Development Center non-OECD countries. So today we have 24 developing countries that are members of the Development Center. 9 of them come from Africa. We have Cabo Verde, Senegal, Morocco, Tunisia, Egypt, Mauritius, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire. Then we have other developing countries in Asia, in Latin America, and we have the big emerging economies, China, India, Indonesia, Brazil, Argentina, South Africa. So this is where I come from. Let me also present you briefly the African Economic Outlook. Luis already said a lot about it. This is a partnership that we are very proud of. This year we have produced the 15th edition of the African Economic Outlook. This is a joint product between the OECD, the African Development Bank, and the United Nations. And it is an instrument that has become a reference point for policymakers, business, civil society, journalists, to get information about African economies. Everything that I say is available for free online. We have a website where you can also find very detailed country notes. So for each one of the 54 countries that are covered in the report, you have 15 pages that describes the economic development, the social development, the political developments, and the special theme that we cover every year. This year, we have decided to answer one question, which is, how can urbanization, which is proceeding very fast in Africa, how can urbanization contribute to the sustainable development of Africa? This is a very timely question for at least 2 reasons. One is because urbanization in Africa is happening at the fastest speed in human history. And second, because in a few weeks, the United Nations will hold in Quito the 3rd Habitat Conference, which, as you may know, is the major international event on urbanization. And so we hope that we'll make a contribution to that as well. Now, let me say up front how I will structure my presentation. I will cover 3 points. 3 main issues. The first point is to give you the bigger picture, so to look at what are the medium-term development prospects for Africa, basically what we have learned throughout these 15 years of African Economic Outlook. The second point will focus on the short-term prospects for the continent. And then the third point will focus on urbanization and transformation of Africa. And we will look at whether Africa is different from other parts of the world. We will look at the costs and benefits of urbanization, and we will very briefly touch upon new strategies that may be necessary to make urbanization work better for Africa. So let me start from the bigger picture, the medium-term development prospects. If you look at this chart, you see that Africa, over the last 15 years, has had a very remarkable growth path. If you look at the green light, this is Africa as a whole. The red one is sub-Saharan Africa, and the blue one is the northern part of Africa. So if you look at the first 10 years of the century until the global financial crisis, Africa as a whole has been growing at over 5% per year, every year. Global financial crisis, of course, had an impact on the performance, but even, and also, of course, the situation in North Africa, notably Libya. But even after these events, Sub-Saharan Africa, in particular, has been quite resilient and displayed steady and buoyant growth even up to today. The situation of last year, 2015, and of this year has been a bit more difficult, and I will explain in a second why. But even in this more complex global landscape, African countries have been quite resilient, so they've performed quite well. Now, despite this very good performance over the last 10 years, African countries have not been able to catch up with the income of OECD countries. So if you look at this chart, we look at, on the left-hand axis, on the vertical axis, you see the per capita GDP as a percentage of the average OECD income. So if you see China, which is the blue dot, went from having in the 1990s less than 10% of the GDP of OECD countries to having today a bit more than 1/3, 30%. If you look at South Africa, it started off in the 1990s at having 40% of the GDP of the OECD average. Today, it went down to slightly above 30%. If you look at the whole picture for Sub-Saharan Africa, excluding South Africa, which is the blue line at the bottom, you see that despite the very strong growth of the last 15 years, per capita GDP, it's still less than 10% of what we have as an average in OECD countries. So the situation here is, of course, African countries have performed very well, much better than in the previous decades, but still the level of per capita income remains very low with respect to the OECD. Another indication of the challenges and the medium-term challenges for Africa is that the integration of African economies in the world economy has increased quite substantially, but is still very small. This is a measure of the share of African countries in international trade of intermediary goods. And it is usually taken as a measure of integration in global value chains, so the international production networks that are now governing the world economy. So if you look at the figure, Africa accounted for 1.4% of world trade of intermediate goods in the beginning of the 90s. This figure has almost doubled, but still in 2012, 2013, Africa represents only 2.2% of world trade of intermediary goods. So very positive because the integration has increased, but still very small. If you look at the domestic structure of the economy, and this explains a lot of the problems that are still present in Africa, the level of productivity in many sectors remain very low with respect to the OECD, and the diversity of productivity level across sectors is also very different, is very wide. So if you look at the, on the left axis, the vertical axis, is the productivity by sector as a percentage of the average productivity for every industry in Africa. And on the little bars that you have on the bottom are the different sectors. So you see that some sectors, for example, mining, are very productive. And this is because you have high-tech companies that are active in these sectors. But if you look at agriculture, for example, productivity is only 36% of the average productivity in Africa. So very low by international standards. I'm sorry about that. Very low for international standards and much lower than other sectors. So Africa has a very significant problem of productivity internationally. Labor productivity is very low, and across sectors. There are sectors that are very productive, like mining, but the most job-intense sectors, like agriculture, are still very low productivity. This is probably one of the most striking facts that we will observe on Africa, is demography. The other one is urbanization. This is the demographic trends of several parts of the world in the period 1970 to 2010 and 2010 to 2050. So the first point to note is that between 2050, African population is going to double and is going to reach 2 billions. But if you look at the situation between the 70s and in the next 40 years, 2010 to 2050, you will see that while in this period 1970-2010, sub-Saharan African population has been more or less at the same level as of China and India, while in these other parts of the world, population in the next 40 years are going to stabilize and decrease, in Africa, it is going to increase. And as I said, it's going to increase by over 1 billion. So by 2050, Africa will have 2 billion inhabitants. What is also striking is that this population is very young. In fact, Africa is the youngest continent on Earth. So there is a lot of young people that are entering into the labor market. We estimate that the labor supply between 2050 will increase by 900 million people, which means that every year between now and 2050, African countries need to create about 29, 30 million jobs per year. So this is the magnitude of the challenge that African countries face. Population is growing, more jobs needed, almost 30 million jobs per year to be created. The other big trend that is important to note is urbanization, and this is the special topic of this year's report. Today, Africans still live for a majority in rural areas. The rate of urbanization today is below 40%. So, yeah, between 35 and 40%. By 2040, the majority of Africans will be living in cities. And if you look at the urbanization process over time, and I don't know whether, no, I don't have the chart, but the urbanization in Africa is happening at the fastest rate in human history. Basically, in Africa, you're having a process that is twice as fast what we have observed in Europe. So let me quote just one figure. In Europe, in order to move from 15% of population living in city to 40% of the population living in city, it took us 110 years. So in 1800, 15% of the population was living in cities. In 1910, 40% of the population living in cities. In Africa, the same change only took 60 years. So 120 years, 60 years. So this is just to give you an idea of how fast urbanization is taking place. And this is creating, of course, a lot of potential benefits because agglomeration creates a lot of economies of scale and you can improve the distribution of resources, but creates also a lot of challenges in terms of overcrowding, pollution, and responding to a lot of population coming into new areas. Let me now, after having looked at the medium-term factors, have a look at the short-term macroeconomic prospects of Africa. As we have already heard in the introduction, Africa has been growing in 2016 at about 3.6% on average. This is higher than the world rate of growth, that was 3.1, but is much lower than what Africa used to have in the past. You remember I said for almost 15 years, Africa was growing at more than 5% per year. And in fact, the rate of growth of 2015 was the lowest since 2009, when the global financial crisis was hitting. Still, 3.6 is a pretty good number. And our projection is that next year, 2017, this number could be above 4%. We're talking about 4.5%. Of course, it depends on a series of factors coming into play. If you look at the geographical distribution of growth, East Africa in 2015 was the strongest, although growing a bit slower than 2014. East Africa, so Kenya, Ethiopia, Tanzania were the best performers. West Africa declined substantially in 2015, one of the reasons being Ebola that hit several countries in that year. The laggards remain Southern Africa, where South Africa in particular is displaying a lot of problems in changing its economic structure. So 2016, Africa as a whole, 3.6%. The champions on the east, the west comes second, and the remaining is in the middle. What is happening next year? Well, many things can change. In particular, a lot will depend on how African countries will be affected by the decline in demand and in decline of prices of commodities, because a lot of the growth of African countries in the last 15 years was driven by commodity prices and demand from China. A lot will depend on what monetary policy will be. The very accommodative monetary policies in the US and in Europe has been, and in Japan as well, has fueled a lot of international capital flows going into Africa. But as was said previously, we have seen that there has been a decline over the last year in the inflows of flows into Africa because monetary policy has become tightened in the last year. Still, our assumption led us to estimate that in 2017 growth will be around 4.5% for the continent, but there are risks that need to be taken into account, in particular the decline in commodity prices, the persisting problems with energy in Africa, power shortages, the risk related to droughts that unfortunately because of climate change are becoming more and more frequent. And of course, there is the problem in some parts of Africa of terrorism and violence that is fueling a lot of problems. One very important factor that I have to mention, and if you're interested in the report, there is a lot of discussion about the many drivers of African performance, the assumptions, and what happens country by country. I'm not going to go into that, but I just wanted to focus on China, because China has been one of the major sources of development for Africa over the last 15 years, by both buying commodities from Africa, but also investing a lot, especially into infrastructure, but not only infrastructure in Africa. So since China is now slowing down, and we have seen that the demand for commodities has gone down, and prices as well, big question is, how will Africa be affected? So our colleagues in the World Bank did an exercise, and this is the result of the exercise, where they tried to compute the net effect of the changes that are taking place in China. Because on one hand, China is consuming less imports, less primary goods, but at the same time, China changes its model of growth, focusing much more on internal sources of development. And this may open up new opportunities for African countries, in particular for agricultural exports, and it may also lead to delocalization of jobs from China to Africa as wages in China are going up. So the colleagues in the World Bank did this exercise where they tried to compute the net effect of these two forces: lower demand for commodities, but also rebalancing of growth and new demand for new goods. And they find that for most African countries, the effect is going to be positive. There are a few countries for which the effect is going to be negative. One of them is Zambia. But for most countries, the net impact is going to be positive, and is the green triangle is there. So on average, it's going to be positive. Let me now move to the spatial focus of this year. I mentioned that urbanization is one of the major trends that is shaping African development. Urbanization is taking place at an incredible speed in Africa, and this is potentially contributing to the transformation of Africa. So far, it has not been the case. So we are hopeful that if African countries put in place the right policies, urbanization can become a factor for the transformation of Africa. But so far, urbanization has not been the force of transformation that we have observed in other parts of the world. For example, if you look at East Asia and the Pacific, the blue line, in that region of the world, urbanization has progressed very fast, but it has also been accompanied by industrialization. So what this chart shows you is on the bottom, you have the level of urbanization, 15%, 20%, up to 50, 55%. And on the vertical axis, you have the share of manufacturing in total value added. So if you look at East Asia in 1966, when they had 20% rate of urbanization, so 80% of people were still living outside of cities. At the time, the share of value added in total, the share of manufacturing in total value added was about 23-24%. Once East Asia reached more than 50% of urbanization, which was around 2013, the level of manufacturing in total value added was slightly less than 30%. So what we have observed is that urbanization moved from 20 to 50%, and industry continued to increase its importance in total GDP. If you look at Africa, the opposite has been happening. Urbanization has increased at a very fast pace, but the share of manufacturing in total value added is today lower than it was in the 70s. So what several economists are observing and warning is that we may observe in Africa premature deindustrialization, meaning that many African countries could develop without developing industry and moving directly into the services sector. Now, there is nothing wrong with the services sector, but in Africa, most of the services sector remain in the informal economy, and they're not generating the good quality jobs that the young people that I mentioned before are in need of. And we cannot expect that the service sector alone will generate the 30 million jobs that African countries need to create between now and 2050. So, how can we help African countries and cities make urbanization becoming a source for sustainable development? We looked at this in very much detail in the report, and we have placed the question of urbanization as part of the bigger question of transforming African economies and societies. And this has three dimensions. One is the economic dimension, meaning reallocating resources, capital, people, and land, from sectors that are low productivity to sectors that can be more productive. The second one is the demographic trends and the demographic transition. There is a huge demographic dividend that Africa could reap because of this huge youth population that will enter into the labor market and relatively less people that are dependent, so either old people or children. And then there is the third dimension of transformation, which is the spatial one, so the agglomeration around cities. If we try to do an exercise in classifying African countries according to these three characteristics, where do they stand with respect to their demographic transition? Where do they stand with respect to urbanization? And where do they stand with respect to economic transformation? Because the problem is often that you look at Africa as a unicum, indifferentiated set of countries. But in fact, countries are very different. And these countries will need different solutions according to their starting point and their structural situation. So we have identified 5 groups of countries, diversifiers, that are those countries that have already started the demographic transition, they have more than 50% of urbanization level, and they have a relatively diversified economy. Then you have countries that have urbanized quite early on, that have started the demographic transition, but still have a relatively undiversified economic structure. And then you have the others, those that have not started yet urbanization, that are still agrarians, and those that are predominantly natural resource dependent. Now, what we have observed is that the situation in these countries is, of course, different, and the type of urbanization is also different. And in particular, if you look at the majority of the countries, leaving aside the diversifiers, the biggest increase that will take place in population is going to come either from rural areas or from small cities, small, quote unquote, below 500, 500,000 inhabitants. So the biggest increase in population and in urbanization is going to take place in smaller cities. Sorry, my time is over. In smaller cities and coming from rural areas, which means that the type of policies that we will have to put in place to handle urbanization will have to focus around the development of what we call intermediary cities. We cannot expect that cities become megalopolis. In fact, we have done a study for OECD countries, and we see that the positive gains from urbanization stops once you reach about 7 million people. Once a city is bigger than 7 million, you start to have declining economies of scale. Pollution, congestion, and so on and so forth. So let me very briefly try to conclude by saying that urbanization creates a lot of opportunities. One is that it increases the market connection with rural areas, and so it can have a tremendous impact on food security and productivity in agriculture. You remember I said agriculture is very low productivity. If we had more developed urban centers that are better connected to rural areas, this can reduce time to market. It will make demand in cities known to agriculture producing areas, and this will facilitate investment in agriculture, better productivity, and increased level of food security. So potentially, if we had greater urbanization, we could have very positive impacts on the agricultural and food supply chains. Similar thing for infrastructure and regional integration. These are some of the major transcontinental networks that are being planned in Africa. They connect major cities in Africa. If these networks were realized, Africa will change dramatically because it will be possible to go from north to south, 10,000 kilometers, but also have all the coastal outer routes, motorways on the western coast, and this will make a tremendous impact on regional integration and market integration in the continent. But urbanization also comes with costs, and this is something that we tend to underestimate. We did a little calculation this year, and if you look at the cost of pollution and how many people are dying because of pollution in Africa City, this is quite appalling. We calculated that air pollution cost Africa almost cost 447 billions every year, which is equivalent to 1/3 of African GDP. So if you look at urbanization, a lot of potential benefits, but also unplanned urbanization, a lot of potential costs, one of which is greatly underestimated, which is the cost of air pollution. For the first time, we have estimates that show that at least 1/3 of Africa's GDP is lost because of premature death due to air pollution. I'm almost done. Just to say that, okay, huge opportunity, population growth, urbanization, but how you do it? You have to do it differently country by country. We saw that there are different groups of countries that need different policies. These policies need to be financed. And when you look at the resources that are available to cities in Africa, these are very small. We did here a little comparison with some cities in Latin America and in the Philippines. And you have the blue lines, which is the amount of intergovernmental transfers, so resources that these cities get from the central government. And the red one is this revenue that the city is capable to generate itself. And so if you see that in Colombia, most cities are able to generate a lot of resources themselves, Philippines as well. But when you look at African cities, the amount of taxes that they're able to generate locally is very small. And the amount of central transfers is the major part of the story. So African cities today do not have enough resources to finance the huge infrastructure needs and public service delivery investment that they need to do. And they will have to increase much more the resource generation capacity locally, which implies changing also the tax system, better taxing land, dealing with informality, changing the personal income taxes, and so on and so forth. So let me conclude. If you were to ask African citizen, what is the single most important thing you want? Jobs is the answer. This is something that we calculate in our study. We look at protests throughout the year, and we look at the reasons behind those protests. And the top 3 reasons for having strikes, manifestation, riots, whatever, is related to jobs. Increase the salary and improve working conditions. So how do you create 29 million jobs per year in Africa by 2030? Many things have been tried in the past. One was to expand public employment. We have seen that this is not working. But there are many options that African countries can look upon. Many countries have natural resources that are still underexploited. If you look at the average amount of investment in Australia or in Canada for exploration of natural resources, is in the range of $60 per square meter. In Africa, it's about $5 per square meter. So you see the difference in investment needs that are still unmet for exploiting natural resources that are already in the ground. Integration in global value chains, still very limited, so there is a huge potential there as well. Agriculture, you have seen that the productivity in the agricultural sector is still very low, and is probably one of the sectors of the future for Africa. And of course also services, especially if they manage to develop better jobs, less informal jobs. There is no single solution, no silver bullet. A combination of all of this is needed. What we don't have to do is to fall back in the problems that we had in the 90s, where we thought that there was a kind of checklist and silver bullet that will apply to every single country to deliver jobs. We need to take into account the specificities of each job, and this is what we try to do in this report by looking at the situation of different countries. Gracias, Luis.
Muchas gracias, Federico, por tu capacidad de simplificación, ¿no?, de un informe tan complicado y tan profundo como es este. Y si quieren, vamos a proceder a, si tienen interés en hacerle alguna pregunta, pues me imagino que estará encantado de responderla. La pueden hacer en español, porque él lo entiende, nos engaña, pero no, lo entiende perfectamente. Así que si hay alguien interesado en preguntas, sí. Pablo, de la compañía Vinter.
Thank you. First of all, congratulations for your great analysis and forecast statement. We've talked about a reality, which is urbanization growth in Africa, but it is also true that in almost all the city centers that are developing in a natural, messy way, we could sometimes even say somehow chaotic. Yeah. Considering the importance that city centers are having following all the data that has been shown today, I would like to ask two questions. The first one would be, is urban planning in the roadmap of the development strategy of any of the main institutions, investors, or international advisors? And the second hand would be, don't you think that the more that construction keeps growing, the more difficult would be to solve this city planning in the future? Thank you very much.
Okay, muchas gracias. No, for sure, urban planning is going to be a major component of the strategies that I was hinting at. I didn't go into details because we don't have time, but I could have shown you the consequences of lack of planning. We had a very nice chart of Accra in Ghana that shows how the cities has been growing, sprawling. So by occupying even more land, but in a totally unplanned way, which is basically cancelling out all the positive impacts that agglomeration can bring. Because people will have to travel more, because distances are increasing from home to the workplace, because it becomes more difficult for the providers of public services to deliver those services, and because the way that the land is used is not sustainable. We have some projections in the report that shows how the increase in land use in Africa is going to, even keeping how can I say, the amount of land available fixed, but given population growth and urbanization, the intensity of land use is going to increase several times, many times. So this is creating a lot of troubles, because if you don't plan well housing, services, mass transport systems, you're basically magnifying poverty in a much more dense areas. So for us, urban planning is going to be a must, but it's not enough. We cannot ask architects and urban planners to solve the problem of jobs. They can make the life of people in the city more pleasant, which is very important. But in the end, we also need to think about jobs, how the jobs are going to be created. The construction sector is for sure going to be a major source of job creation in Africa. And I think that here there are several opportunities also for Canary Islands, for Spain, for Europe. It's not only for China. China is making a great job, but it's not only for China to build. And the infrastructure needs that are estimated today are still huge. how we build those things will make a difference for the generation to come. So your point is very well taken. Urban planning needs to have a better role, and there are suggestions in the report. It's not the only answer, because we need to create jobs, not only better cities. Constructions is going to be a major source of jobs, but it needs to be done better. And to some extent, the fact that we still need to build a lot of the stock of infrastructure gives to African cities an opportunity to build them much better than what has been done in the past.
Hola, buenos días. Tenía la tentación de callarme, pero no he podido. Vamos a ver, yo no comparto que las oportunidades de Canarias para participar en el sector de la construcción en África estén presentes de ninguna manera. Y no lo creo porque justamente desde los organismos que generan programas específicos para la internacionalización o informes como este que al final los generas pero no se ponen en práctica, o no hay una coordinación ni una sinergia entre diferentes organismos que permitan que la planificación no sea del urbanismo, sino de las estrategias económicas, políticas y sociales. El gran fallo es ese, desde mi punto de vista, la dispersión de la información, el gigantismo de los programas, el mimetismo de los programas. Se generan unos programas absolutamente encorsetados, con unos objetivos etéreos que no son capaces de entrar en la realidad de lo que es, por ejemplo, el tejido productivo canario. Para internacionalizar una empresa, internacionalizarse tiene que tener unas estructuras financieras, económicas, técnicas muy importantes. El tejido productivo canario tiene unas características que no se tienen en cuenta. Y desde mi punto de vista, lo que habría que hacer es que esa sinergia entre los diferentes organismos permitan una planificación para el Gobierno de Canarias. El Gobierno de Canarias es quien tiene que liderar, ¿verdad, Pablo? O sea, que nos dejen generar nosotros los programas. Muchas veces tú y yo hemos hablado de esta cuestión. El que el Gobierno de Canarias pueda liderar mediante una serie de fondos específicos propios, y digo propios que vengan de los organismos públicos, pero que puedan generarse programas en plaza y poderlos desarrollar con los agentes económicos y los organismos, Casa África, cámaras de comercio, de verdad, con un trabajo sinérgico. Yo creo que hay que bajar al terreno un poco más. Nosotros sabemos lo que hay que hacer. Yo creo que aquí nadie, tanto el Gobierno de Canarias como Casa África, como las cámaras de comercio, sabemos lo que hay que hacer. Pero no disponemos de la flexibilidad necesaria para poder adaptar los programas a nuestra idiosincrasia.
Bueno, nosotros desde el Gobierno canario y por alusión directa al Gobierno, y como hemos hablado muchas veces, tenemos herramientas para apoyar la internacionalización de las empresas, ¿no? Y tenemos un programa concretamente, que es con los medios que disponemos, un programa que es de apoyo a las empresas que se quieran internacionalizar, que es el programa Aporta, que está teniendo unos resultados bastante interesantes, y es un programa tremendamente flexible porque permite, bueno, prácticamente adaptarnos a la realidad de la empresa que lo requiere, ¿no? Es cierto, con unas limitaciones presupuestarias, con unas limitaciones financieras, ¿no? Pero los resultados de ese programa, si vemos los resultados, son muy interesantes, ¿no? Bueno, es lo que puedo decir, ¿no? Después también tenemos otra serie de programas europeos que tú conoces bien, y es cierto que los intentos de empresas constructoras por hacer cosas en África, no, bueno, algunos han funcionado en algunas empresas y otros no. Eso es una realidad que está ahí, que conocemos, ¿no? Bueno, no es sencillo, no es sencillo, no es fácil, y todo pasa, no todo pasa, pero una clave es la presencia de las empresas en territorio africano, ¿no? Si nunca vas a poder internacionalizarte a África con la complejidad que tiene si no estás absolutamente presente 24 horas en África, ¿no? Y claro, eso es un coste que no siempre es asumible por empresas pequeñas que no tienen esa capacidad, ¿no? Bueno, como siempre, y yo creo que también hay en este informe, ¿no? Siempre hablamos de las oportunidades, también hay dificultades y amenazas, ¿no? Y ya quería retomar con una, a lo mejor con una pregunta. I would like to ask also one question, if you don't mind. Sí, okay. La inmigración, ¿no? Para mí la principal preocupación de este crecimiento, que África vaya a doblar la población en 2050, que no está tan lejos, ¿no? Dentro de 35 años, es que vayan a pasar a 2.000 millones, que la África occidental más cercana a Canarias vaya a pasar de 350 a 700 millones de habitantes, con esa necesidad de crear 30 millones o 15 millones de empleos, si nos referimos a la parte de West África, ¿no? ¿Ustedes realizan algún tipo de previsión sobre cuáles serían las estimaciones de inmigración o de inmigración africana? Porque realmente cuando la gran sociedad europea, creo yo, no ni siquiera es la opinión del gobierno, sino la opinión de Pablo Martín Carvajal, cuando la gran sociedad europea mira a África, es cuando vienen los inmigrantes. Después, bueno, está allí y no se fija tanto, ¿no? Pero cuando hay la gran llamada, ¿no? Entonces, ¿hay previsiones o tienen en cuenta esa variable dentro de todas sus analíticas macroeconómicas de la inmigración y cuál podría ser el impacto en las economías europeas, españolas y, bueno, ya nos tocará a nosotros hacer la Canaria, ¿no? Pero...
Bueno, pregunta difícil. So the first point about the potential of the construction companies to be more active and contribute to filling these investment needs and construction needs in Africa. I think that the answer that was given is much better than what I can say. Small and medium enterprises do not necessarily have all the tools, financial information, knowledge of markets that are necessary, and so the support from governments is, of course, very important. But let us look at the opportunity side. I was saying that there is a huge unmet construction need in cities. We estimate that at least 2/3 of the investment that will have to be made for cities in Africa is still to be made. And if I recall well, depending on the estimates, every year African cities need to invest between 12 and 35 billions of dollars to build urban infrastructures. So between now and 2050, 2/3 of this investment will have to be made. It's not existing today. So there is a huge demand that needs to be filled. Who is going to fill this demand? Public investment is very important, but it's not going to be enough. Foreign investors coming into Africa will play a very important role. Still, foreign investors going into the infrastructure sector in Africa, very little, for a number of reasons. One is maybe lack of knowledge about the opportunities, especially for the smaller enterprises. Second is political risk. Many enterprises still think that risk is too high, and so they're asking for guarantees or for other type of insurance policies. And third is the fact that capacities in many administrations in Africa to develop what we call bankable projects are very limited. Efforts have been made. The African Development Bank has put up a specific fund to help supporting the capacities in public administration in Africa to do bankable projects. But doing a PPP or project financing is a very complex transaction that requires many partners to a very high level of technical capacities. So there is still a long way to go. The answer is improving the coordination, as you said, improving the information, improving the coordination. Still, long way to go. We had a quick look at African countries and which country had an urban planning strategy. Only 1/3 of the African countries had in place some kind of national urban plan strategy. So, again, a lot of possible cooperation opportunities between cities to help developing these master plans for urban development that will be one important component for attracting investors because they will know what the needs and what the objectives are. Going to the point of migration, the OECD just released yesterday our international migration outlook that provides estimates about migration flows and look at the impacts of migration on OECD countries, including Spain, and policies that can help to maximize the positive impact of migration. So I will not go into comment that too much because is not in my portfolio, but what we found is that the net contribution of migrants to receiving countries is generally zero or positive. When you look at fiscal, how much they contribute, how much they take out, is usually net, zero or positive. Immigration that we have observed over the last year has, of course, been driven a lot by refugees. So it's a new type of migration that we were not maybe used to observe in the past. But for sure, labor migration is going to increase. That's a fact that is going to stay. On the other hand, Europe is going to age. We're having a very rapidly aging population. So unless there are major developments in automation, robots, and these kind of things, we will need more workers. The question is what kind of policies you can put in place to make sure that these workers are positively contributing to national development. At the same time, we will also observe an increase in intra-African migration, which in fact is already quite substantial. And one important point to take into account is that people tend to migrate. The richer they become, the higher the incentive is to migrate, because it becomes less costly. So as African countries will become more developed, it may well be that more people will have an incentive to migrate unless there are domestic opportunities to have a productive life and to have a decent life. And this is why we are ringing the bell and say we should be aware that demography is there. There are already 300 million people in the labor force that need to find a job, which is more than the European Union as a whole. And cities are becoming a major source of, a potential major source of development in Africa. So we should look at what we could do, not only financially, to support African countries to turn these two trends, population and urbanization, into sources of opportunities. And if more opportunities are available, less people will go into to migrate.
Diferente a lo que estamos hablando ahora mismo. Ante ese desarrollo vertiginoso, casi desbordante que se espera de África, y por supuesto el principal problema no solo en África, sino yo creo que en el mundo es el empleo, quizás yo, y esta es mi reflexión, veo que el principal reto al que se pueda enfrentar el continente africano para que su población y sobre todo la población joven consiga ese empleo sería la formación, la educación. Porque claro, es que ese desarrollo demográfico desbordante, más a la vez ese movimiento demográfico hacia las ciudades, el reto, desde mi punto de vista más importante, va a estar ahí. Si queremos que crezca la productividad, pero crece la población sin formación, desde luego el futuro no es prometedor.
No, claro. In fact, we are doing also a study on international migration and development that will be released towards the end of the year. And the question of education is one of the major ones that we try to look at. I mentioned that people tend to, the richer they become, the easier it becomes to migrate, because you can buy yourself a ticket, you have a network of friends or family members abroad. You don't need to take the very difficult and dangerous routes of illegal migration. But the more educated you are, the higher is, the lower is this probability. So investing in education, investing in technical education and vocational training is a major priority for Africa. 4 years ago, the African Outlook looked at the question of youth employment. And we look at what were the major reasons why people in Africa were unemployed, young people were unemployed or underemployed. The first one is lack of jobs. The fact that the growth model that has been characterizing African countries has not been able to create enough jobs. Driven by commodities and mining, these are not very job-intensive sectors. The job-intensive sectors are agriculture, services, and industry. And as you remember, productivity remains very low. So the capacity to create jobs remains very low. The second most important sector was skill mismatches. The fact that the type of skills that African young people acquire formally or informally at school or on the jobs are not those that are in demand. So there is a major change that also needs to take place, both domestically in African countries, but also in the development partners, in the donor agencies, in the multilateral institution, to help change the way that the education system produces the skills that are in need. And for this, a much closer interaction between this system and the private sector, that are those that are creating jobs, is necessary. So we are doing some specific studies. There is one who's going to be released at the end of the month in Togo, where we look at options for Togo to change the education system and deliver better skills to the young people. But you are totally right. Education is probably one of the most challenging, but also, again, opportunity. Because more educated people, more productive people, capable to take the development into their hands, their own development into their hands.
No,
Sí.
Simplemente, ¿hay una pregunta?
Sí, la última pregunta, si me dejas. Supongo que el crecimiento demográfico está descontado de la mortalidad, porque también nacen muchos, pero mueren muchos. Supongo que sí, porque no he hablado del nivel de mortalidad todavía en África. Está decreciendo. Y la otra parte es veo hay un crecimiento diferente o a dos ritmos en el norte de África y el resto de África. Y eso me gustaría que si pudiera incidir sobre eso. Gracias.
Mortality in Africa is going down and life expectancy is increasing. And this is the big window of opportunity because you have more productive people coming into the labor force that can work longer, and you have less people that are dependent, so either the children or the old people. And this the demographic transition, according to some estimate, could bring to Africa between 15% and 30% increase in GDP in the next few decades, if it were to take place. But for this to take place, there are a number of policies that need to happen, notably in the area of family reproductive policies, because the demography needs at some point to stabilize. And what we have seen comparing African countries to China is that Africa still has a fertility rate that is much higher than what China had, and also other developing countries, when they enter the demographic transition. So there is still a very important problem to be tackled in terms of fertility and how to stabilize that. Mortality, thank God, is going down, so people are living longer, although because of the factor that I show of urbanization, more people are likely to die because of new reasons, like pollution that was not necessarily there before. The two dynamics of North Africa and Southern Africa. Well, Northern African countries are, if you remember, we had these 5 categories. Among the diversifiers, so those that have already urbanized, those that have already started the demographic transition, and those that have more diversified economies, most of those countries are in Northern Africa. Egypt, Tunisia, Morocco, Algeria, and Libya are a bit different. These are the countries that have the greatest potential, because also of proximity to the European markets, because of the bigger investment that were made in education, because of the fact that stability, for good or bad, attracted a lot of investment in the early decades. The current situation in some of these countries is troubling. Libya, the instability in some other parts of the region. So we have seen that they have been leading, but they are now kind of stabilizing. And so there is a big question mark. Of course, Tunisia, Morocco have huge potential, also thanks to investments from France, Spain. Egypt, to be seen. Libya is a big question mark. Southern Africa is not homogeneous. There are different regions. The best performing countries are those in East Africa. It used to be the contrary. It used to be West Africa because of natural resources export. West African countries are still doing decently well, but those that are exporting natural resources will take a hit because prices are going down, and they have to make bigger investment in agriculture. That is probably a major source of development for them. But still, I mentioned the question of droughts, so irrigation is going to become a major question for them. In East Africa, they have more diversified economic structures. They are also much more advanced in terms of regional integration. The East African community is a reality, so they created a bigger market, and they were able to attract multinationals that are willing to serve a bigger market. The other parts, Central Africa, there is, of course, a lot that has to do with the Democratic Republic of Congo. So what's happened there is the big brother in the region. is uncertain, and Southern Africa is mainly driven by South Africa itself. South Africa used to be the most developed countries, but recently the situation there has been difficult, both because of natural resources, gold prices going down, but also for an inability to put in place structural reforms that can free more resources and allow the transformation that unfortunately is not taking place yet there.
No, yo simplemente quería, si me lo permite Luis, quería hacer una pequeña reflexión sobre, bueno, cómo después de haber escuchado el informe de la Economic Outlook, bueno, pues qué papel puede enfrentar Canarias, ¿no? Como gobierno de Canarias, qué papel puede enfrentar Canarias, ¿no? Y efectivamente veo que ese crecimiento de África, ese crecimiento poblacional puede generar muchas oportunidades, que tenemos que ser activos, ¿no? Para poder saber aprovecharlas, ¿no? Pero el hecho de que las clases medias estén subiendo, el hecho de que uno de los pilares en los que se fundamenta ese crecimiento sea en la mayor demanda de consumo, ¿no? Con todo lo que eso implica en el tema de empresarial, ¿no? Creo que también hay oportunidades interesantes. Bueno, lo que acabas de decir, ¿no? Del desarrollo urbano, de que solamente 1/3 de las ciudades tienen planificación urbanística, ¿no? Yo creo que desde Canarias tenemos experiencia suficiente para poder ofrecer esos servicios en todo lo que es planificación urbana y en esos proyectos que hay de colaboración entre ciudades, ¿no? Hay un potencial enorme con todas las ciudades africanas cercanas a Canarias. La formación, en Canarias tenemos centros de formación de primer orden, públicos, privados, que también podrían ser internacionalizados en el continente africano. Has hablado de agricultura también, ¿por qué no la agricultura? O que Canarias se convierta en un centro de servicios de una región de crecimiento y dinamismo, ¿no? Lógicamente también hay amenazas, yo creo que están principalmente vinculadas con la posibilidad de la inmigración, si llegara a ocurrir como ocurrió en 2006, pero bueno, eso es predecirlo, es absolutamente imposible. Pero bueno, yo creo que Canarias se puede posicionar o debería posicionarse como un socio, ¿no? de todos estos países africanos en sectores donde tenemos claras oportunidades.
Federico, muchísimas gracias por tus palabras y a todos ustedes gracias por asistir a esta conferencia.